In the suffocating heat of Mississippi summer in 1874, 13 plantation masters woke to a nightmare worse than death itself. Their wives had vanished without a trace, simply evaporated from locked bedrooms, leaving behind only the faint scent of jasmine and a single black feather on pristine white pillows. Within hours, the men would receive letters that would destroy them in ways no bullet or blade ever could. Letters containing secrets so devastating, so personally humiliating, that several of the masters would take their own lives rather than face the exposure. But this wasn't the work of a ghost or demon, as some would later claim. This was the calculated revenge of a man who had lost everything to these same plantation owners, a man who had been forced to watch his family torn apart, sold like cattle to different corners of the South. A man who had spent 8 years planning the perfect vengeance, one that wouldn't just kill his enemies, but would destroy their legacies, shatter their reputations, and ensure their names would be remembered with shame and mockery for generations to come. They called him the Black Widower, though few knew his real name. And by the time the truth came out, it was already too late. The damage had been done, and 13 of Mississippi's most powerful men had been brought to their knees, not by violence, but by something far more devastating. The complete annihilation of everything they held sacred. Their honor, their reputations, their carefully constructed images as respectable gentlemen. All of it reduced to ashes by a man they had once owned. A man whose humanity they had never even acknowledged. Before I reveal exactly how this man orchestrated one of the most elaborate revenge schemes in American history, I need you to do something. Hit that subscribe button right now, because stories like this, stories that expose the darkest corners of our past, stories that reveal how the oppressed sometimes found ways to strike back against their oppressors, these are exactly what we uncover on this channel. And drop a comment telling me what's the most elaborate revenge story you've ever heard, because I guarantee nothing will compare to what you're about to hear. This is a tale that will make you question everything you thought you knew about justice, about revenge, and about the limits of human patience and planning. The story doesn't begin in 1874, but 16 years earlier, in the cruel summer of 1858, on a cotton plantation in Natchez, Mississippi, called Riverside Manor. This wasn't just any plantation. It was one of the most prosperous in the entire state, spanning over 3,000 acres of prime Mississippi Delta land, worked by more than 200 enslaved people who toiled from sunrise to sunset, 6 days a week, producing the white gold that made their master one of the richest men in the South. The master of Riverside Manor was Colonel Marcus Whitmore, a man who prided himself on being a gentleman farmer, one of those plantation owners who liked to think of themselves as benevolent patriarchs, providing for their people while conveniently ignoring the fact that those people were held in bondage, bought and sold at auction, separated from their families on whim, and subjected to violence whenever they stepped out of line. Whitmore would tell visitors to his plantation that he treated his slaves well, that he was a Christian master who understood his responsibilities before God. He would point to the fact that he allowed enslaved families to live together in cabins rather than being separated into gender-specific barracks. He would mention that he rarely used the whip himself, preferring to delegate such unpleasantness to his overseers. He would speak with genuine conviction about his role as a caretaker of people who were, in his view, incapable of caring for themselves. This self-deception was common among the planter class, a necessary fiction that allowed them to sleep at night despite the systematic brutality on which their wealth was built. Whitmore genuinely believed himself to be a good man, a moral man, a man who would be judged favorably by history. He had no capacity to understand that, from the perspective of the people he enslaved, his occasional kindnesses were meaningless in the context of their fundamental lack of freedom, their inability to make choices about their own lives, their knowledge that at any moment they or their loved ones could be sold away to pay a debt or settle a business transaction. Whitmore was part of a tight-knit circle of 13 plantation masters who controlled not just the economy of Adams County, but virtually every aspect of life within it. They met monthly at the Natchez Gentlemen's Club, a Greek revival mansion on the bluffs overlooking the Mississippi River, where they smoked Cuban cigars, drank French brandy imported at tremendous expense, discussed politics and cotton prices, arranged marriages between their children, and made decisions that affected thousands of lives without ever consulting those whose lives hung in the balance. These meetings were social occasions, but they were also exercises in power. The 13 men represented an interlocking network of control that extended into every corner of Adams County society. They decided who received credit and who didn't. They determined which cases came before the courts and how those cases would be decided. They controlled access to education, to economic opportunity, to political participation. They were, in essence, a shadow government more powerful than any elected official, accountable to no one except each other. These 13 men represented the absolute pinnacle of Southern aristocracy. They were Colonel Marcus Whitmore of Riverside Manor, the unofficial leader, owner of 240 slaves, considered the richest man in the county, a man whose word carried more weight than any law or regulation. Then there was Judge Beauregard Sinclair of Oakwood Plantation, a circuit court judge who used his position to protect the interests of slaveholders and punish anyone who challenged the social order. He was known for creative interpretations of law that always seemed to benefit the planter class and for harsh sentences handed down to free black people who stepped out of line. Dr. Cornelius Hampton of Magnolia Heights served as the most prominent physician in Natchez, but his real contribution to the circle was providing medical justifications for slavery. He wrote papers arguing that black people were biologically inferior, that they had smaller brains, that they were naturally suited to labor in hot climates, that slavery was actually beneficial to their health compared to the supposed rigors of freedom. These pseudo-scientific arguments were published in Southern medical journals and cited by politicians defending the institution. Reverend Isaiah Pemberton of Willow Creek Estate brought religious authority to the group. As a Baptist minister, he preached every Sunday that slavery was ordained by God, that the curse of Ham explained why black people were destined to be servants, that slaves should submit to their masters as to Christ himself. His sermons provided moral cover for the entire system, allowing slaveholders to feel that they were doing God's work rather than committing an ongoing crime against humanity. Captain Theodore Ashford of Ashford Acres was a former military officer who treated his plantation like an army camp and his slaves like soldiers under his command. He maintained rigid discipline, conducted morning inspections, and punished infractions with military precision. He believed that efficiency and order were the keys to successful plantation management, and he shared his methods with the other members of the circle. Attorney Harrison Blackwood of Blackwood Hall specialized in slave law, drafting contracts for slave sales, defending masters accused of excessive cruelty, and finding legal loopholes that allowed slaveholders to evade the few restrictions that existed on their power. He was brilliant at his work, able to argue that black was white and up was down if it served his clients' interests. Banker Silas Rutherford of Cedar Grove financed slave purchases and plantation expansions, profiting from human misery while maintaining an air of respectability. He had calculated the exact monetary value of human beings of different ages, skills, and physical conditions, reducing people to numbers in a ledger. Mayor Jonathan Prescott of Twin Oaks was the political face of the planter class, ensuring that local government served their interests exclusively. He appointed sheriffs and tax assessors, controlled the distribution of government contracts, and made sure that any challenges to the social order were crushed before they could gain momentum. Sheriff Augustus Caldwell of Pinehurst enforced slave codes with brutal efficiency and personally led slave patrols that terrorized the black community, both enslaved and free. He seemed to take genuine pleasure in hunting runaway slaves, in breaking up secret church meetings, in making sure that black people understood their place. Merchant William Dougherty of Rosewood owned the largest general store in Natchez and refused to sell to free black people, ensuring their economic dependence on white intermediaries who would charge them higher prices. Cotton factor Edmund Weatherly of Belmont was the middleman who sold the region's cotton to northern and European markets, making enormous commissions while maintaining the fiction that he was simply a neutral businessman facilitating trade. Overseer Coordinator Jasper Thornton of Thornfield supplied and trained overseers for multiple plantations, teaching them the most effective methods of control and punishment. He ran what amounted to a school for overseers, where young white men learned techniques of intimidation, the strategic use of violence, and the psychological manipulation necessary to control large groups of enslaved people. And finally, plantation manager Vincent Hargrove of Hargrove House managed several absentee-owned plantations and pioneered new techniques for maximizing labor extraction, constantly experimenting with ways to get more work out of enslaved people while minimizing their costs, treating human beings as machines to be optimized. These 13 men formed an interlocking network of power. They intermarried their children to consolidate their holdings, creating dynastic alliances that would last for generations. They invested in each other's ventures, sharing both risks and profits. They covered for each other's crimes, providing alibis and false testimony when needed. They presented a united front against any challenge to the slave system that had made them wealthy beyond imagination. When abolitionists published pamphlets criticizing slavery, these men organized public burnings of the offending literature. When Northern politicians spoke about limiting slavery's expansion, these men contributed money to Southern rights candidates. When enslaved people resisted through work slowdowns or subtle sabotage, these men compared notes on the most effective punishments. They saw themselves as defenders of civilization, standing against the chaos that would supposedly result if black people were freed. And in the summer of 1858, they made a decision that would seem insignificant to them, just another business transaction in a lifetime of such transactions. But that would set in motion events that would eventually destroy them all. It was the kind of decision they made routinely, without thought or hesitation, the kind of decision that illustrated the absolute power they held over human lives. On Riverside Manor, there lived an enslaved family that seemed, by the standards of slavery, relatively fortunate. Thomas was 35 years old and worked as a skilled carpenter. He had learned the trade from his father, who had learned it from his father, a line of craftsmanship that stretched back through generations. Thomas could build furniture that was both beautiful and functional, could construct outbuildings that would stand for decades, could repair almost anything that broke. His skill made him valuable to Colonel Whitmore, and that value translated into small privileges. His wife, Claire, age 32, worked as a seamstress in the main house, creating and repairing garments for the Whitmore family. She had quick, clever fingers and an eye for detail that made her indispensable to Mrs. Whitmore, who prided herself on being the best-dressed woman in Natchez society. Together, Thomas and Claire had 4 children. Marcus, their eldest at 14, was beginning to learn carpentry from his father, showing promise with his hands and his eye for measurement. Elizabeth, 12 years old, helped her mother with sewing and had begun learning to read secretly, taught by an elderly enslaved woman who had been educated before laws were passed prohibiting such instruction. Samuel, 8 years old, was bright and curious, full of questions about how things worked, always following his father around the plantation asking why and how and what if. And little Grace, only 5 years old, was the joy of the family, a cheerful child whose laughter could make even the hardest day of forced labor seem bearable. Thomas and Claire had managed what many enslaved couples could not. They had kept their family together. They lived in a small cabin at the edge of the slave quarters, cramped but their own. A space where they could close the door and pretend for a few hours each night that they were free, that they were just a family like any other family. They told their children stories, taught them skills, tried to prepare them for lives that might one day include freedom, though neither parent truly believed they would live to see emancipation. Thomas occupied an ambiguous position in the plantation hierarchy. His carpentry skills made him valuable, gave him slightly more autonomy than field hands, slightly better food, a small weekly allowance that he could use to purchase extra provisions or save toward some dimly imagined future. But that slight privilege was also precarious, dependent entirely on Whitmore's goodwill, which could evaporate at any moment for any reason or no reason at all. Thomas understood this. He had seen skilled artisans sold away for minor infractions, had watched as families more stable than his own were broken up to settle debts or to punish perceived disrespect. He lived with constant low-level anxiety, always aware that everything he loved could be taken from him in an instant. And in August of 1858, that anxiety proved justified. Colonel Whitmore had accumulated substantial gambling debts during a trip to New Orleans. He had spent 2 weeks in the city ostensibly on cotton business, but had spent most of his time in gambling houses, drinking heavily and making increasingly reckless bets. He fancied himself skilled at cards, but in reality he was an easy mark for professional gamblers who knew how to manipulate drunk, overconfident plantation owners. By the time Whitmore returned to Natchez, he owed $12,000 to various creditors, debts that needed to be paid quickly to avoid scandal and potential legal action. For a man of Whitmore's wealth, $12,000 shouldn't have been catastrophic, but he had overextended himself in other investments, and his liquid capital was limited. The easiest way to raise cash quickly was to sell some of his property, specifically his human property. Whitmore consulted with his circle of 13, several of whom were in the market for skilled labor or domestic servants, and they came up with a plan that would benefit all of them while maximizing Whitmore's profit. They would break up Thomas's family and sell the members separately. This strategy made economic sense from the slaveholders' perspective. Families sold together brought lower prices than individuals sold separately. A skilled carpenter like Thomas could command a higher price if sold alone to someone who specifically needed carpentry skills. Children sold individually could be trained to their new owner's specific requirements without the influence of their parents. It was purely a business calculation, the kind of decision made thousands of times across the South, with no more moral weight than deciding which fields to plant with cotton and which with corn. The specific plan was this. Marcus, the 14-year-old boy who was just reaching the age where he could perform adult labor, would go to Judge Sinclair, who needed field hands for his expanding cotton operation and liked to acquire young men he could train from an early age to be obedient and efficient. Elizabeth, the 12-year-old girl, would go to Reverend Pemberton, whose wife wanted a personal maid who could be trained to her specific preferences and who would be young enough not to have developed bad habits from previous owners. Samuel, the 8-year-old, would go to Captain Ashford, who liked to acquire young boys and train them from childhood to be loyal personal servants, believing that early training produced the most devoted slaves. Little Grace, only 5 years old, would stay with Whitmore temporarily, and then be sold at the next major slave auction in Natchez, where young children often fetched good prices from speculators who would raise them and resell them later, or from plantations that wanted to breed future generations of slaves. As for Thomas and Claire, Whitmore initially planned to keep them, but attorney Blackwood made him an offer for the couple. Blackwood had a contact in Louisiana who needed skilled slaves for a plantation being developed in the Bayou country. The buyer was willing to pay premium prices for a carpenter and a seamstress, especially ones who were married and therefore might be more stable and less likely to run away. Whitmore accepted the offer, effectively ensuring that Thomas and Claire would never see their children again. Louisiana was hundreds of miles away, and enslaved people had no means of communication over such distances. The sale would sever the family completely and permanently. The transaction was arranged on a Thursday afternoon in mid-August at the Natchez Gentlemen's Club. The 13 men gathered in their usual back room, surrounded by mahogany furniture and oil paintings of long-dead plantation owners. Money changed hands, gold coins and promissory notes carefully counted and recorded. Documents were signed and witnessed, legal papers that treated human beings as livestock, describing Thomas as one Negro man, skilled carpenter, age approximately 35 years, and his wife as one Negro woman, seamstress, age approximately 32 years. The children were similarly reduced to inventory items, their ages and potential uses noted with the same attention given to describing a horse's age and temperament. Brandy was poured to celebrate the successful negotiation. The 13 men congratulated each other on their business acumen. Whitmore's gambling debts would be covered. The others had acquired useful slaves at fair prices. Everyone was satisfied. The business was concluded in less than an hour, and the men moved on to other topics, discussing politics and cotton prices and the upcoming social season. None of them gave a second thought to the family they had just destroyed. They had executed hundreds of similar transactions over their lifetimes. This was simply how business was done. Thomas knew nothing of this transaction until Saturday morning. He had been sent into town on Friday to purchase supplies and repair tools, an errand that took most of the day. He returned to Riverside Manor late in the evening, tired but looking forward to seeing his family, to having dinner with them in their cabin, to hearing about his children's day. When he reached the cabin, he found it empty. Not just empty of people, but empty of their few possessions. The small trunk where Claire kept their clothes was gone. The pallet where the children slept was bare. The few cooking implements they owned had been removed. For a moment, Thomas stood in the doorway, his mind unable to process what he was seeing. Then panic set in. He ran to the main house, ignoring the protocol that required enslaved people to approach slowly and wait to be acknowledged. He pounded on the back door until the cook opened it, looking frightened at his urgency. "Where is my family?" Thomas demanded. "Where are Claire and the children?" The cook, an elderly woman who had known Thomas his entire life, looked at him with a mixture of pity and fear. She told him softly that they had been taken away that morning, that Overseer Davis had come with a wagon and several white men, that Claire had been crying and the children had been screaming, but they had been loaded into the wagon and driven away. Thomas ran to the overseer's house, a structure near the main plantation house where Davis lived. He demanded to know where his family had been taken, what was happening, when they would return. Davis looked at him with irritation and contempt. "Your family has been sold," Davis said flatly. "The colonel needed to raise some money, and he sold them. Your wife is going to Louisiana. The children have been sold to different folks around the county. That's all I know, and that's all you need to know. Now get back to your cabin before I have you whipped for disturbing me." Thomas felt his legs give out. He sank to his knees in the dirt outside Davis's house, his mind reeling. Sold. His wife sold to Louisiana. His children scattered to different owners around Adams County. His family destroyed, erased, as if the 15 years he had spent building a life with Claire, the 14 years he had spent raising his children, meant nothing. As if they were objects that could be redistributed at will, with no more consideration than would be given to selling furniture or livestock. He didn't remember walking back to his cabin. He didn't remember how long he sat there in the dark, his mind circling endlessly around the impossibility of what had happened. His children's voices echoed in his memory. Claire's face appeared before him, smiling the way she had smiled that morning when he left for town, not knowing it would be the last time he would ever see her. The weight of loss crushed down on him, making it hard to breathe, making him wish he could simply cease to exist, because existing without his family seemed unbearable. But as the hours passed and dawn approached, grief began to transmute into rage. Thomas was not a violent man by nature. He had spent his entire adult life being careful, being strategic, understanding that survival under slavery required the suppression of anger, the maintenance of at least an appearance of acceptance. But something in him broke that night. The careful self-control he had maintained for 35 years shattered, and what emerged was a fury so intense it felt like it might consume him from the inside. He made a decision. He would not accept this. He would not submit quietly to the destruction of everything he loved. He would run. He would escape and find his family. It was an impossible plan. He didn't know exactly where Claire had been taken, only that it was somewhere in Louisiana. He didn't know which plantations his children had been sold to, only that they were somewhere in Adams County. He had no money, no resources, no allies. Running away was extremely dangerous, and captured runaways faced horrific punishments. But Thomas didn't care about danger or consequences anymore. His family was gone, and if he couldn't find them, then he would at least die trying rather than continue living as if their loss was acceptable. On Saturday night, Thomas packed a small bag with a few tools, some food stolen from the plantation stores, and a knife he used for carpentry. He waited until after midnight, when the plantation was quiet and the patrols had passed through his section. Then he set out, heading east toward the woods that bordered Riverside Manor, planning to travel at night and hide during the day until he was far enough from Natchez to be safe. He made it less than 5 miles. The slave patrols that operated throughout Adams County were efficient and experienced in hunting human beings. They had dogs trained to track scent. They knew all the likely routes runaways would take, and they were motivated by substantial rewards paid for captured escapees. Thomas heard the dogs before he saw them, heard their baying in the distance growing steadily closer. He tried to run faster, tried to find a stream where he could lose his scent, but he was exhausted from grief and lack of sleep, and the dogs were faster. They caught him at the edge of a creek, the hounds surrounding him while their handlers approached with guns drawn. Sheriff Augustus Caldwell, one of the 13 plantation masters, led the patrol that night. He looked at Thomas with satisfaction, seeing another runaway captured, another demonstration of white authority successfully enforced. Thomas considered fighting, considered forcing them to shoot him, but some survival instinct held him back. He surrendered without resistance and was taken back to Riverside Manor in chains. Colonel Whitmore was furious when he learned that Thomas had attempted to escape. In Whitmore's view, he had treated Thomas well, given him privileged position as a skilled artisan, allowed him to live with his family for years. That Thomas would respond to a simple business transaction by running away struck Whitmore as the height of ingratitude and insubordination. He decided to make an example of Thomas, to ensure that all his other slaves understood that resistance would not be tolerated. On Sunday morning, after church services, Whitmore had all his slaves assembled in the area between the main house and the slave quarters. More than 200 people gathered, including children and the elderly, everyone required to witness what was about to happen. A whipping post stood in the center of the area, a permanent fixture that served as a constant reminder of the violence underlying the entire system. Thomas was brought out by 2 overseers who stripped off his shirt and tied his hands to the post, stretching his arms above his head so that his back was completely exposed. Whitmore stood on the porch of the main house, where he could be clearly seen and heard by everyone present. He announced that Thomas would receive 50 lashes as punishment for attempted escape, and that this was merciful compared to what he deserved. Then he nodded to Davis, the overseer, who picked up the whip. The whip used for punishing slaves was not like a horse whip. It was specifically designed to cause maximum pain and damage to human flesh. The leather thong was thick at the handle and tapered to a thin, flexible end that would crack like a gunshot when swung properly. In the hands of an experienced user, it could lay open skin, expose muscle, even crack bones if applied with enough force. Davis was very experienced. The first lash made a sound like a pistol shot, and Thomas's body jerked against the post. The second lash crossed the first, creating an X pattern of torn flesh on his back. By the 10th lash, blood was running down his back, soaking into his pants. By the 20th, he had stopped making sounds, his voice gone from screaming. By the 30th, he had lost consciousness, his body hanging limp from the ropes that held his wrists to the post. Davis continued whipping his unconscious body until all 50 lashes had been delivered, following Whitmore's orders exactly. When it was over, Thomas's back was a horror of torn flesh and exposed muscle and bone. Dr. Hampton, who was present among the assembled plantation masters, come to witness the punishment, examined Thomas and announced that he would probably survive if infection didn't set in, though he would carry the scars for life. Thomas was cut down from the post and dragged back to his cabin, where he was left alone to recover or die, whichever came first. But Whitmore wasn't finished. As additional punishment, he announced that Thomas would not be sold to Louisiana after all. Instead, he had arranged a new sale. Thomas would be sold to a chain gang working in the swamps of southern Louisiana, clearing land and building levees. These gangs were notorious throughout the South as basically death sentences. The work was brutal, performed in malarial swamps where disease was rampant. Workers were driven mercilessly by overseers who knew that replacements were cheap and readily available. Men sent to the swamp gangs typically survived less than 2 years. Whitmore's message was clear. Thomas would die slowly and painfully as punishment for daring to resist. But before Thomas was taken away to Louisiana, something happened that would haunt the 13 plantation masters for the rest of their lives, though they wouldn't understand its significance until much later. Thomas had regained consciousness, but was too weak to stand. He lay on the floor of his cabin, his destroyed back making every breath agony. 4 days after the whipping, the 13 men came to inspect him before he was transported. They wanted to see the results of their lesson in power, to confirm that their authority had been properly demonstrated. Thomas heard them approaching, heard their voices outside his cabin discussing him as if he were a dangerous animal that had been successfully caged. They entered the cabin, and Thomas forced himself to turn his head, forced himself to look at them despite the pain even that small movement caused. He saw their faces, saw their satisfaction and contempt and complete lack of empathy. And something crystallized in his mind, some core of rage and determination that went deeper than pain, deeper than despair, deeper even than his grief over his lost family. Thomas spoke. His voice was weak, barely above a whisper, roughened by screaming and dehydration. But it was clear enough for all 13 men to hear. "You think you can do this and face no consequences," he said. "You think you're untouchable. But I swear to you, on everything I hold sacred, on my children's lives that you've stolen from me, on my wife that you've torn from my arms, you will pay for this. Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but you will pay. Every single one of you. And when that day comes, you'll wish you'd never been born." The 13 men looked at each other and laughed. What could a broken slave do to them? What threat could a man who was about to be worked to death in a Louisiana swamp possibly represent? The oath was meaningless, the desperate curse of a powerless man trying to maintain some shred of dignity in the face of absolute defeat. They turned and left the cabin, still laughing, already forgetting Thomas and his empty threat as they moved on to more important matters. They had no way of knowing that Thomas's oath was not empty. They had no way of knowing that some promises are so profound, so fundamental to a person's sense of self, that they become unbreakable, that they shape everything that comes after. They had no way of knowing that in 16 years Thomas, calling himself by a new name, transformed by education and experience and an all-consuming desire for vengeance, would return to Natchez with a plan so elaborate, so psychologically devastating, that it would become legend, whispered about in shocked tones throughout the South for generations. But before we can understand Thomas's revenge, we need to understand what happened to him in those 16 years between his oath and his return. We need to follow his journey from that cabin, where he lay broken and bleeding, to the moment he stepped off a riverboat in Natchez as Thomas Winchester, gentleman investor from Chicago. Because that transformation, that seemingly impossible elevation from slave to gentleman, was itself the first and most important element of his revenge. Everything else would flow from his ability to move among his enemies as an equal, unseen and unsuspected, gathering information and weaving the web that would eventually destroy them all. Thomas was transported to Louisiana in chains, loaded onto a flat boat with a dozen other slaves being sent to various destinations along the Mississippi River and its tributaries. The journey took a week, during which Thomas drifted in and out of consciousness, his wounded back becoming infected, despite crude attempts at treatment. By the time they reached the work camp in the swamps south of Baton Rouge, he was delirious with fever, and the camp overseer who took delivery of him expressed doubt that he would survive long enough to be worth the purchase price. But Thomas did survive. Through sheer force of will, through the burning need to keep the oath he had made, he fought off the infection and slowly began to recover. The work camp was everything he had heard and worse. 200 men labored in waist-deep water, digging drainage canals and building levees, working from dawn until dusk with only brief breaks for minimal food. The overseer and his assistants used whips freely, maintaining discipline through constant threat of violence. Men died regularly from accidents, disease, snakebite, or simple exhaustion, and their bodies were buried in unmarked graves in the swamp. Thomas understood immediately that if he was going to survive, he would need to become valuable in some way that set him apart from the other workers. He began offering to repair tools and equipment, using his carpentry skills to fix broken handles and construct simple devices that made the work slightly easier. The overseer, a brutal man named Cassidy who cared only about productivity, recognized that Thomas's skills could be useful. He assigned Thomas to maintenance work rather than canal digging, a position that was marginally less dangerous and exhausting. Over the next 18 months, Thomas worked and planned. He understood that escaping from the work camp would be extraordinarily difficult. They were isolated in the swamps, miles from any town or road. The overseers were constantly vigilant against escape attempts, and runaways who were caught were tortured to death as examples to the others. But Thomas was patient. He repaired tools and studied the geography of the region, noting where the solid ground was, which waterways led toward civilization, where the overseer stored weapons and supplies. And then, in April of 1861, everything changed. News reached the work camp that southern states were seceding from the Union. That war was coming. The overseer and his assistants became distracted, worried about their own futures. Some of them left to join Confederate military units. Security at the camp became lax as the remaining overseers struggled to maintain control with reduced staff. Thomas waited for his moment. It came on a hot night in June when a storm rolled through the area, heavy rain and wind that covered sounds and reduced visibility. Thomas slipped away from the camp during the chaos of the storm, taking a small boat used for moving supplies and disappearing into the network of waterways that crisscrossed the swamp. He traveled for 3 days, sleeping during the day and moving at night, before he reached solid ground and found a road that led north. The Confederacy in 1861 was in turmoil. Men were marching off to war, women were taking over plantation management, and enslaved people were beginning to understand that the conflict might offer opportunities for freedom. Thomas moved through this chaos carefully, avoiding white people when possible, claiming when necessary to be traveling to join his master, who was with a Confederate regiment. His light skin and ability to speak well helped him pass casual scrutiny. He made it to Tennessee after 6 weeks of dangerous travel, and there he encountered Union forces that had pushed south into the state. The Union Army had a policy of accepting escaped slaves as contraband of war, refused to return them to Confederate owners. Thomas presented himself to a Union camp and was accepted into service as a laborer, working for the army but not as a soldier, since black men were not yet allowed to enlist in combat units. Working with the Union Army, Thomas discovered abilities he hadn't known he possessed. His carpentry skills were valuable for building fortifications and structures. His knowledge of southern geography made him useful as a scout who could navigate terrain and identify good positions for camps. And his intelligence, finally given opportunity for expression, became apparent to the officers he worked with. One of those officers was a chaplain from Massachusetts named Reverend William Hartwell, a committed abolitionist who believed that freed slaves should be educated and prepared for full citizenship. Hartwell noticed Thomas, saw in him a quick mind and a hunger for learning. He began teaching Thomas to read and write, starting with basic letters and sounds, progressing rapidly as Thomas proved to be an exceptional student. Learning to read opened an entire world to Thomas. He devoured every book and newspaper Hartwell could provide. He read about history, about law, about philosophy and science. He read Shakespeare and Dickens, read abolitionist pamphlets and constitutional arguments, read everything he could get his hands on. And as he read, he began to understand the intellectual frameworks that white people used to justify slavery, began to see the contradictions and hypocrisies at the heart of American society. Hartwell noticed something else about Thomas. His skin tone was light enough that he could potentially pass as white if he dressed appropriately and carried himself with confidence. This was an extraordinary advantage, rare and valuable. Hartwell suggested that Thomas might be useful to the Union cause as a spy, someone who could move through Confederate territory without arousing suspicion. Thomas agreed, partly out of gratitude to Hartwell, partly because he recognized that this skill of passing would be crucial for his longer-term plans. He began practicing. He studied how white Southern gentlemen dressed, how they spoke, what gestures and mannerisms marked someone as belonging to the upper class. He learned to adopt a drawl when necessary, to discuss cotton and politics and bloodlines with apparent expertise. And he discovered that white people saw what they expected to see. If you dressed like a gentleman and acted like a gentleman, most white people never questioned whether you belonged. Over the next 3 years, Thomas made several trips into Confederate territory, gathering intelligence about troop movements and supply lines, posing as a merchant or a plantation owner traveling on business. He was never caught, never seriously suspected. The disguise worked perfectly because Confederates couldn't conceive that a black man might be capable of such sophisticated deception. The war years also gave Thomas time to think about revenge. He knew that the 13 men who had destroyed his family were still in Natchez, still living their comfortable lives while the Confederacy fought to preserve slavery. He fantasized about killing them, about walking into the Natchez Gentlemen's Club with a gun and shooting all 13 before they even understood what was happening. But Thomas was too intelligent, too strategic to settle for simple murder. He wanted something more profound, more devastating than quick deaths. He wanted to destroy them the way they had destroyed him, to take everything they valued and grind it into dust. And gradually, as the war continued and Thomas continued his education, an idea began to form. These men prided themselves on their honor, their reputations, their positions in society. They saw themselves as gentlemen, as moral leaders, as defenders of civilization. What if he could destroy those self-images? What if he could expose them as frauds and hypocrites, could make them objects of mockery and contempt? What if he could hurt them in ways that would make them wish for death? When the war ended in 1865, Thomas faced a choice. He could try to find his wife and children scattered across the South, their locations unknown, or he could dedicate himself to revenge against the 13 men who had scattered them. He chose revenge, with the understanding that he would search for his family while preparing his vengeance, that the two goals were not incompatible. Thomas moved to Chicago, where he could disappear into the anonymity of a large northern city and where he could access resources and opportunities that would have been impossible in the South. He used his carpentry skills to establish a legitimate business, building furniture for the city's growing middle class. He was talented and reliable, and his business prospered. Within 2 years, he had accumulated enough capital to expand, hiring other craftsmen and establishing a reputation for quality work. But business was never Thomas's primary focus. His real work happened in the evenings and on Sundays. He spent hundreds of hours in libraries, continuing the education that Hartwell had started. He studied law and business, literature and philosophy, art and music, accumulating all the cultural knowledge that marked someone as educated and refined. He learned which wines were fashionable, which books everyone claimed to have read, which artistic movements were currently in favor. He studied etiquette, memorizing the complicated rules that governed interactions among the upper class. He hired a voice coach, a theatrical professional who helped him eliminate any remaining traces of Southern slave dialect from his speech and adopt instead the refined accent of educated Northern society. They worked on pronunciation, on rhythm and cadence, on the subtle markers that distinguished cultured speech from common. Thomas practiced for hours every day, recording himself and listening back, correcting every vowel and consonant until his speech was indistinguishable from someone born into privilege. He transformed himself physically as well. Good tailoring, careful grooming, the right accessories, all of these helped to create the image of a successful gentleman. Thomas learned to carry himself with the confidence and authority that white society associated with their own class. He practiced walking into rooms as if he owned them, making eye contact as an equal rather than a subordinate, speaking with the assumption that his opinions mattered. The transformation took years. Thomas was patient, methodical, understanding that rushing would be fatal to his plans. He needed to become so thoroughly convincing in his role as Thomas Winchester, successful businessman and gentleman, that no one would ever question whether he was exactly what he appeared to be. He needed to erase Thomas the slave completely, to bury that identity so deep that even people who had known him wouldn't recognize him in his new form. During these years of preparation, Thomas also maintained a network of contacts throughout the South. He corresponded with former slaves who had scattered during the war, with Union veterans who had settled in southern states during Reconstruction, with sympathetic whites who worked with the Freedmen's Bureau. Through this network, he gathered intelligence about what had happened to the 13 plantation masters after the war. He learned that they had all survived, though their fortunes had been damaged by emancipation. Their wealth, which had been based entirely on slave labor, had collapsed. Many had lost their plantations or had been forced to break them up and sell parcels. But they were still alive, still influential in their communities, still wielding power over the freed black population through economic pressure and political manipulation. Thomas also tried desperately to find his wife and children. He placed carefully worded notices in newspapers across the South, advertisements claiming to be looking for family members displaced during the war. He wrote to Freedmen's Bureau offices, asking them to search their records for anyone matching his family's descriptions. He sent letters to contacts in Louisiana and Mississippi, asking them to make inquiries. But the chaos of war and emancipation had scattered millions of people, and record-keeping was minimal or non-existent. In 1867, Thomas received devastating news. A letter arrived from a woman named Sarah, who had known Claire at Belle Rose Plantation in Louisiana. Sarah wrote that Claire had died during the yellow fever epidemic that swept through Louisiana that summer. She had fallen ill and declined rapidly, dying within a week. She had been buried in the plantation cemetery in an unmarked grave. Sarah expressed her condolences and mentioned that Claire had often spoken of her husband and children, had never stopped hoping to find them again. Thomas read the letter multiple times, unable to fully process what it meant. His wife was dead. The woman he had loved for nearly 20 years, the mother of his children, was gone. He would never see her again, never have the chance to tell her that he had survived, that he had never stopped searching for her. For weeks, Thomas couldn't function. He went through the motions of daily life, but internally he was paralyzed by grief. Eventually, the grief began to transmute into something colder and harder. His wife was dead, but his oath remained. The 13 men who had destroyed his family were still alive, still comfortable, still unpunished. Thomas's commitment to revenge, which might have weakened if he had found his family intact, instead strengthened. This was all he had left now. The only way to honor Claire's memory, the only way to make sense of everything that had happened. He also continued searching for his children, but the results were heartbreaking. He learned fragments of information, but nothing conclusive. Marcus, his eldest son, had been sold away from Judge Sinclair's plantation during the war. Sold where? No one knew. The chaos of the Confederate collapse meant that many such transactions were never properly recorded. Elizabeth, his daughter, had run away from Reverend Pemberton's plantation in 1863. Pemberton had sent slave catchers after her, but she had apparently made it to Union lines. Beyond that, her trail went cold. She might have survived, might have built a new life somewhere under a new name, or she might have died in the attempt to escape. Thomas had no way of knowing. Samuel had been taken by Captain Ashford when Ashford fled Mississippi ahead of Union forces in 1863. Ashford had apparently gone to Texas, taking several valuable slaves with him. What happened to Samuel after that was unknown. And Grace, Thomas's youngest child, had been sold at auction when she was 5 years old. She could be anywhere in the South, might not even remember her family, might have been renamed by her purchasers. The likelihood of finding a child sold at 5 years old, now over a decade later, was virtually zero. Thomas came to understand that he would probably never find his children, that the system that had enslaved them had scattered them so thoroughly that reconstruction was impossible. This realization was almost as devastating as learning of Claire's death. He had spent years hoping that someday he might reunite his family, might reclaim what had been stolen from him. Now that hope was gone, and all that remained was rage and the determination to make someone pay for what had been lost. By 1873, Thomas felt ready. He had perfected his disguise as Thomas Winchester, had accumulated enough wealth to fund his plan, had gathered intelligence about the current situations of the 13 plantation masters. He knew where they lived, who their wives were, what vulnerabilities they might have. He had spent 15 years preparing for this moment, 15 years transforming himself from a broken slave into an instrument of revenge. In March of 1874, Thomas Winchester boarded a riverboat in Chicago, bound for Natchez, Mississippi. He was 45 years old, dressed in an expensive suit, carrying letters of introduction from Chicago businessmen, presenting himself as a successful investor interested in opportunities in the recovering South. When he stepped off the boat at the Natchez dock, he looked exactly like what he claimed to be. A wealthy northern gentleman, refined and confident, someone who belonged in the highest levels of society. None of the men waiting on the dock to greet arriving passengers recognized him. How could they? The last time they had seen Thomas, he had been a broken slave with a destroyed back, being shipped off to die in a Louisiana swamp. The possibility that this elegant gentleman could be that same man was literally inconceivable to them. Their own prejudices and assumptions blinded them completely. Thomas checked into the Mansion House, the finest hotel in Natchez, a luxurious establishment perched on the bluffs overlooking the Mississippi River. His room had a view of the water, expensive furniture, all the comforts that wealthy white men expected. He unpacked his belongings, arranged his papers and letters of introduction, and prepared to begin the final phase of his revenge. Over the next several weeks, Thomas inserted himself into Natchez society with practiced skill. He joined the Natchez Business Association, presenting himself as someone interested in investing in local enterprises. He attended church services at the Episcopal Cathedral, the church of choice for the upper class. He dined at the best restaurants, took rooms at the gentlemen's club for afternoon reading, made himself visible and available to the community's leaders. His credentials were impeccable, his manners flawless, his conversation sophisticated and engaging. He discussed literature with the local physician, debated politics with the town's lawyers, analyzed cotton markets with plantation owners and factors. He was charming without being obsequious, confident without being arrogant. Exactly the kind of person that Natchez' elite wanted to welcome into their circle. Within a month, Thomas had secured invitations to the best homes in Natchez. He dined with Judge Sinclair and his young wife Eleanor, discussing legal philosophy and constitutional interpretation. He attended a musical evening at Reverend Pemberton's house, where Mrs. Pemberton served as hostess for a gathering of church members. He met with banker Rutherford to discuss potential investments, impressing the banker with his financial acumen. He was introduced to Sheriff Caldwell, who seemed wary of northern investors but couldn't find any specific reason to object to this particular gentleman. And slowly, methodically, Thomas began gathering information about the 13 men, and more importantly, about their wives. He observed interactions, noted tensions, identified dissatisfactions. He paid attention to small details. Which wives seemed unhappy? Which men treated their spouses with contempt or indifference? Which marriages were obviously loveless arrangements rather than partnerships? What Thomas observed confirmed what he had suspected. The wives of the 13 plantation masters were, almost without exception, deeply unhappy women. Some were young, married off to older men by families seeking advantageous connections. Others were older, trapped in decades-long marriages to men who had never really seen them as people, who treated them as ornaments or servants rather than partners. Almost all of them were starved for attention, for kindness, for any acknowledgement that they had thoughts and feelings worth considering. Southern society in 1874 still operated under rigid rules about gender and class. Respectable women had extremely limited freedom. They couldn't work outside the home, couldn't control their own money, couldn't leave their husbands no matter how miserable the marriage. They were supposed to be pure, submissive, ornamental. Their role was to manage households, raise children, and reflect well on their husband's status. Their own desires and aspirations were irrelevant. For Thomas, these women represented both tools and victims. He would use their vulnerabilities to destroy their husbands, but he also recognized that they were prisoners of the same system that had enslaved him, trapped by different chains, but trapped nonetheless. He didn't hate them, but he also didn't allow sympathy to interfere with his plans. They were necessary sacrifices in his war against the men who had destroyed his family. Thomas began his campaign with Catherine Blackwood, the attorney's wife. Catherine was 42 years old, childless after years of trying, married to Harrison Blackwood for over 20 years. Blackwood spent most of his time in his law office, working on cases and drinking with colleagues. Catherine spent her days managing a large house with the help of servants, attending church activities, and trying to fill empty hours with needlework and reading. Thomas engineered an introduction at a meeting of the Natchez Library Association, where both he and Catherine were members. He positioned himself near her during the meeting, and afterward mentioned a book he thought she might enjoy, based on comments she had made during discussion. Catherine seemed surprised and pleased that anyone had been paying attention to her opinions. They spoke for a few minutes about literature, and Thomas mentioned that he had ordered several new books from Chicago that hadn't yet arrived in Natchez bookstores. He offered to lend them to her once they arrived if she was interested. Over the next several months, Thomas cultivated a friendship with Catherine Blackwood. It started innocently, conversations about books and ideas. Thomas treated her as an intelligent person whose thoughts mattered, which was apparently novel enough that Catherine responded with gratitude and growing warmth. They began meeting for afternoon tea at the hotel, always in public, always perfectly respectable, gradually talking about more personal subjects. Thomas learned about Catherine's disappointments, her loneliness, her sense that her life had been wasted in service to a man who barely acknowledged her existence. He listened with apparent sympathy, made thoughtful observations, provided the kind of emotional support that Blackwood never had. He was patient, never rushing, letting Catherine become comfortable with him, letting affection develop naturally. After 6 months, Catherine suggested they meet somewhere more private. She phrased it carefully, claiming she wanted to discuss some matters too personal for public conversation. Thomas agreed, and they began meeting in a rented room he kept for business purposes. The affair that developed was both physical and emotional, with Catherine experiencing, for perhaps the first time in her life, a relationship where she felt valued and desired. Thomas was meticulous about documentation. He kept every note Catherine wrote to him, carefully preserved and filed. He recorded dates and details of their meetings in a private journal, noting conversations and activities with the thoroughness of someone building a legal case. He even managed to obtain a photograph of the two of them together, arranging it under the guise of having a group picture taken, but positioning the camera to capture just the two of them in an unmistakably intimate pose. After 3 months of affair, when Thomas had gathered sufficient evidence to thoroughly compromise Catherine Blackwood, he began distancing himself slightly, preparing to move on to the next target while keeping Catherine engaged enough that she wouldn't suspect his ultimate intentions. He claimed that business matters were demanding more of his time, that he needed to be careful about maintaining discretion to protect her reputation. Catherine accepted these explanations, grateful for his consideration of her position, and Thomas Winchester moved on to his next conquest, beginning the same patient process with another wife, and then another, building his web of seduction and documentation, gathering the evidence that would eventually destroy all 13 men. The campaign would take 18 months to complete, 18 months of sustained psychological manipulation, of becoming whatever each woman needed him to be, of maintaining multiple simultaneous affairs without any of the women discovering the truth. It was exhausting work, emotionally and psychologically draining. Thomas wasn't a naturally duplicitous person. Before slavery had destroyed his family, he had been honest and straightforward, incapable of the kind of sustained lying his revenge required. But he had learned that survival sometimes required becoming someone you wouldn't recognize, doing things you never thought yourself capable of. And his rage, his need for revenge, was strong enough to carry him through the moral compromises his plan demanded. Each seduction followed a similar pattern, but was customized to the specific woman. For Margaret Whitmore, the elderly wife of Colonel Whitmore, Thomas became the cultured gentleman who treated her with the respect and admiration her husband had forgotten to show. Margaret had once been considered a great beauty, the belle of Natchez society. But 40 years of marriage to a man obsessed with wealth and power had reduced her to an afterthought in her own home. Thomas made her feel seen again, valued again, desirable again. Their affair was tender rather than passionate, but it was real enough to compromise her thoroughly. For Eleanor Sinclair, the young second wife of Judge Sinclair, Thomas became the exciting near contemporary who made her feel young and alive rather than trapped and suffocated. Eleanor had been married off to the judge when she was 19, and he was 56, essentially sold by her family to secure a valuable connection. She had spent 7 years in a loveless marriage to a man old enough to be her grandfather, a man who wanted a decorative wife but had no interest in her as a person. Thomas's attention, his genuine interest in her thoughts and dreams, his willingness to treat her as an equal, was intoxicating. Their affair was passionate and reckless, with Eleanor taking risks that surprised even Thomas. For Abigail Pemberton, the minister's wife, Thomas became the understanding confidant who didn't judge her for having desires and needs that her husband's theology claimed she shouldn't have. Abigail had spent her entire adult life suppressing every impulse and desire that didn't fit the narrow definition of Christian womanhood her husband preached. She was supposed to be pure, submissive, selfless, existing only to serve her husband and the church. Thomas offered her permission to be human, to acknowledge needs that her religion told her were sinful. Their affair had an element of rebellion, of Abigail finally allowing herself to want something for herself, rather than constantly sacrificing for others. Each woman, each affair, required Thomas to become someone slightly different, to mirror back what each wife needed to see. It was a virtuoso performance of manipulation, sustained over 18 months, requiring him to keep track of multiple stories and personalities while maintaining his public identity as Thomas Winchester, respected businessman. The psychological toll was enormous. Thomas found himself sometimes forgetting which version of himself he was supposed to be, which woman he was meeting, which set of problems he was supposed to be sympathetically discussing. He started keeping detailed notes, not just for documentation, but to help him remember who knew what, who believed which lies, who expected what kind of behavior. And underneath all the deception, underneath the performance, Thomas carried constant guilt about what he was doing to these women. They were victims of the same men he was targeting, trapped by a system that gave them no power and few choices. Using them as weapons against their husbands felt like victimizing them twice. But Thomas had come too far, invested too much to stop now. His oath to his destroyed family, his need to make the 13 men pay for what they had done, overrode any ethical concerns about collateral damage. By October 1874, Thomas Winchester had completed his extraordinary campaign. He had seduced all 13 wives of the surviving plantation masters. Actually, since 2 of the original 13 men had died, he had seduced 11 wives, but he had also decided to include the widows of the 2 dead men, bringing his total to 13 women, a number that felt symbolically appropriate given the original circle of 13 men who had destroyed his family. He had documentation for every affair, meticulously organized and prepared for maximum impact. He had photographs of himself with each woman, some innocent-looking but damning in context, others unmistakably intimate. He had letters and notes, dozens of them, written in the women's own hands, expressing love and desire and plans for secret meetings. He had detailed diary entries describing the physical intimacy of each affair, written with enough specificity that no one could dismiss them as fabrications. And he had prepared a final element that would tie everything together and ensure the men understood exactly why this was happening to them. For each of the 13 books he planned to create, Thomas wrote a personal letter addressed to the husband, explaining exactly who Thomas Winchester really was, reminding them of what they had done to his family 16 years earlier, and making it clear that this destruction of their reputations and marriages was deliberate revenge, calculated and executed with the same cold precision they had used when destroying his family. In late October, Thomas Winchester disappeared from Natchez, telling his business associates that urgent matters in Chicago required his attention for several months. In reality, he traveled to Memphis, where he could work anonymously on the final preparations without risk of being discovered. He rented a small office and hired a printing company, swearing them to secrecy about the nature of the project. Over 2 weeks, Thomas supervised the creation of 13 identical leather-bound books, each beautifully made with gilt edging and high-quality paper, the kind of elegant volume that might contain poetry or philosophy. But instead of literature, each book contained a complete documentation of Thomas's affair with one specific wife. The books were organized chronologically, starting with the first meeting between Thomas and the wife, progressing through the development of their relationship, including the full text of every letter and note, Thomas's diary entries describing their meetings in explicit detail, and the photographic evidence that made denial impossible. Each book concluded with Thomas's personal letter to the husband, explaining his true identity and his motivation for revenge. These letters were masterpieces of controlled rage, laying out in precise detail exactly what the 13 men had done to Thomas's family. Exactly how that destruction had felt. Exactly why this public humiliation was appropriate and deserved punishment for their crimes. Thomas also prepared additional copies of each book to be distributed beyond the immediate husbands. He understood that for his revenge to work, it couldn't be private. The entire community needed to know what had happened, needed to see these supposedly respectable men exposed as cuckolds who couldn't even control their own wives. The shame needed to be public, permanent, and complete. In early November, Thomas arranged for the books to be mailed simultaneously to multiple recipients. Each husband would receive his specific book, but copies would also go to the Natchez Daily Courier, the town's newspaper, to the ministers of the 3 largest churches in Natchez, to the president of the Natchez Business Association, to the mayor and city council members, and to several prominent women known for being the centers of social gossip networks. The timing was carefully calculated. Thomas arranged for all the books to arrive on the same day, November 15, 1874, ensuring that the news would break simultaneously across Natchez society before anyone could attempt to suppress or contain it. It would be impossible to prevent the scandal from spreading when dozens of people received the information at the same time. Thomas mailed the books from Memphis on November 12th, using a courier service that guaranteed delivery within 3 days. Then he boarded a train heading north, leaving the South entirely, putting distance between himself and the devastation he was about to unleash. He had no intention of being anywhere near Natchez when the books arrived and the scandal exploded. On the morning of November 15th, 1874, the books began arriving at their various destinations. Colonel Marcus Whitmore received his copy at breakfast, delivered by a courier who waited for no response. Whitmore opened the elegant volume, expecting perhaps a gift book or some business proposal. Instead, he found page after page documenting his wife Margaret's affair with Thomas Winchester, complete with letters in Margaret's unmistakable handwriting, diary entries describing intimate encounters in explicit detail, and photographs that left no doubt about the physical nature of the relationship. Whitmore read through the book in growing horror, his face turning first red, then pale, as the implications sank in. His wife had been unfaithful. She had cuckolded him with a northern businessman. Everyone in Natchez was receiving this information simultaneously. His reputation, his honor, everything he had built over 6 decades was being destroyed in a single morning. But then Whitmore reached the final section of the book, Thomas's personal letter explaining who he really was and why he had done this. And Whitmore's horror turned to something deeper, a kind of existential terror. Thomas Winchester was the slave Thomas, the man whose family Whitmore had casually destroyed 16 years ago. The man who had sworn revenge while lying in a pool of his own blood. The oath that Whitmore had dismissed as the empty threat of a powerless slave had been real. Thomas had survived, had transformed himself, had returned, and had executed a revenge so complete that Whitmore's entire world was now collapsing. Whitmore felt his left arm go numb, felt pressure in his chest like a great weight crushing down on him. He tried to stand but couldn't coordinate his limbs. He was having a stroke, his body's response to stress too overwhelming to process. He collapsed at the breakfast table, the book falling from his hands, pages scattering across the floor. Servants ran for the doctor, but by the time Dr. Hampton arrived, Whitmore was unconscious, half his body paralyzed, unable to speak. He would linger for 3 days in this condition before dying, without ever regaining consciousness, one of the first casualties of Thomas's revenge. Similar scenes played out across Natchez that morning. Judge Beauregard Sinclair received his book at his law office, where he had been reviewing case files. He read through the documentation of his young wife Eleanor's passionate affair with Thomas Winchester, read Eleanor's letters expressing love and desire for another man, read diary entries describing acts of intimacy that violated everything Sinclair thought he knew about his wife. The photographs were particularly devastating, showing Eleanor and Thomas in poses that made clear this wasn't simple friendship. Then Sinclair reached Thomas's letter explaining his true identity and his motivation. And Sinclair understood with sickening clarity that he had been targeted deliberately, that his humiliation was punishment for his role in destroying Thomas's family 16 years earlier, that a man he had thought safely dead had returned and destroyed him in turn. Sinclair sat at his desk for perhaps an hour, the book open before him, his mind cycling through implications. His marriage was over. His reputation was destroyed. His position in society was finished. He was 68 years old, and everything he had built over a lifetime was gone. Sinclair took a pistol from his desk drawer, wrote a brief note blaming his wife for his death, and shot himself through the head. His clerk found him 20 minutes later and ran screaming into the street, adding to the chaos that was already developing as word of the books spread through Natchez. By afternoon, the news had spread throughout the town. Thomas Winchester, the respected northern businessman who had become a welcome member of Natchez society, was actually Thomas the slave, who had been sold to a death sentence 16 years ago after his family was destroyed. He had returned in disguise and had systematically seduced the wives of all 13 plantation masters responsible for that destruction. He had documented every affair meticulously and had now exposed everything simultaneously, destroying the reputations of Natchez's most prominent men in a single coordinated strike. The scandal was unprecedented. Nothing like it had ever happened in Natchez, possibly in the entire South. The combination of sexual impropriety, racial implications, and cold revenge created a story so sensational that newspapers across the South picked it up within days. Northern newspapers also covered it, with many expressing a kind of grim satisfaction that Southern slaveholders were finally experiencing consequences for their cruelty. The reactions from the remaining men and their wives varied, but none escaped humiliation. Reverend Isaiah Pemberton's congregation demanded his immediate resignation after learning of his wife Abigail's affair. Pemberton tried to argue that his wife's sin didn't disqualify him from ministry, but the church leadership was unmoved. They couldn't have a minister whose wife was an admitted adulteress. It undermined his moral authority completely. Pemberton left Natchez within a week, moving to a small town in Arkansas where no one knew his history. But even there, the scandal eventually caught up with him. He never preached again, living out his remaining years in bitter obscurity. Captain Theodore Ashford reacted with rage rather than despair. He wanted to challenge Thomas Winchester to a duel to satisfy honor through violence in the traditional Southern manner. But Thomas had disappeared, could not be found or contacted. Ashford's impotent fury made him look ridiculous, a man screaming threats at someone who wasn't even present to hear them. His wife fled to live with relatives in Georgia, and Ashford was left alone in his decaying plantation house, drinking heavily and ranting about northern perfidy to anyone who would listen. Attorney Harrison Blackwood tried to argue that the books were elaborate forgeries, that Thomas Winchester had fabricated everything to embarrass Natchez's leading citizens for some unknown political purpose. But this defense collapsed when several of the wives, confronted by their husbands, admitted the affairs were real. Blackwood's own wife, Catherine, confirmed that she had been intimate with Thomas Winchester, that the letters in the book were genuinely written by her, that everything documented was true. Blackwood's attempt to maintain denial in the face of his wife's confession made him look foolish as well as cuckolded. Banker Silas Rutherford found that his business clients no longer trusted him. If he couldn't manage his own household, if he couldn't even keep his wife faithful, how could he be trusted to manage other people's money? Within months, most of his accounts had been transferred to other banks, and Rutherford was facing financial ruin on top of social humiliation. The remaining men suffered similar fates. Mayor Jonathan Prescott's political career ended instantly. No one would vote for a man who had been so publicly humiliated. Sheriff Augustus Caldwell lost his position and was actually driven out of Adams County by vigilantes, who took advantage of his weakened status to settle old scores from his years of brutal enforcement of racial control. Merchant William Dougherty's store was boycotted by customers who didn't want to be associated with him. Cotton factor Edmund Weatherly's business partners terminated their relationships. Plantation manager Vincent Hargrove was fired by the northern investors who employed him and couldn't find work anywhere. The wives also suffered, though their suffering was of a different character. Some were divorced by their humiliated husbands and found themselves suddenly without support, forced to rely on relatives who were often resentful about having to take them in. Others remained married but in relationships that had become prisons of mutual hatred and recrimination. Several left Natchez entirely, seeking refuge in distant cities where they might start over under assumed names. At least 3 of the wives attempted suicide in the weeks following the scandal's exposure, though most survived their attempts. The scandal dominated conversation in Natchez for months, then years. The revelation that Thomas Winchester was actually the former slave Thomas, that he had transformed himself so completely that he'd moved among the upper class as an equal for over a year, that he'd seduced 11 wives as revenge for what their husbands had done to his family, challenged every assumption white Southerners held about race and the natural order of society. How could a former slave have become so refined, so educated, so capable of navigating upper-class society without detection? It suggested that the racial theories used to justify slavery might be wrong, that black people's supposed inferiority was a lie told to excuse oppression rather than a fact of nature. This implication was almost as disturbing to white Southerners as the sexual scandal itself. Some called it the most elaborate revenge in American history. Others called it the most disgraceful scandal the South had ever seen. Black residents of Natchez and surrounding areas had mixed reactions. Some were horrified, worried that Thomas's actions would bring reprisals down on the entire black community. Others expressed a grim satisfaction that white men who had committed atrocities with impunity had finally faced consequences. The story spread through black communities across the South, becoming a legend about resistance and the possibility of striking back against oppressors. Thomas Winchester himself disappeared completely. After mailing the books from Memphis, he traveled north to Chicago, closed out his business affairs, and vanished. Some claimed he went to Canada, others to Europe. There were reports of a distinguished black gentleman matching his description living in Paris in the 1880s, teaching English to French students and writing articles about American racial politics for European newspapers. But none of these reports were confirmed. What is certain is that Thomas never returned to the South and never publicly acknowledged what he had done in Natchez. The revenge he had spent 16 years planning and executing was complete. The 13 men who had destroyed his family had been destroyed in turn, their reputations shattered, their remaining years lived in shame and humiliation. It wasn't the same as getting his family back. Nothing could restore what had been taken from him. But it was justice of a kind, imperfect and costly, but real. The story of the Black Widower, as Thomas came to be called in whispered conversations, became part of the hidden history of Reconstruction, the stories that freed people told each other about resistance and survival. It was a reminder that even in a system designed to grant absolute power to white people, even when the law offered no protection and society granted no recognition of black humanity, it was still possible to strike back, still possible to make oppressors pay a price for their cruelty. For historians who would later study this period, the story raised complicated questions about justice and revenge. Was Thomas Winchester's elaborate scheme justified? He had destroyed not just the men who wronged him, but also their wives, who were arguably victims of the same patriarchal system that had enabled slavery. He had manipulated and used these women, had violated their trust, had exposed them to public humiliation and private suffering. Could that be justified as legitimate revenge against their husbands? There are no easy answers to these questions. Thomas himself probably struggled with them in his remaining years. But what is undeniable is that he achieved what he set out to do. He made the 13 men who destroyed his family pay a price for what they had done. He showed that the powerless could find ways to strike back against the powerful, that patience and planning and intelligence could accomplish what force alone never could. His revenge was complete, devastating, and permanent. The men he targeted never recovered, and their names went down in history associated with shame and scandal, rather than the respectability they had worked their entire lives to achieve. And somewhere, whether in Canada or Europe or some hidden corner of America, Thomas Winchester, formerly Thomas the Slave, lived out his remaining years knowing that he had kept the oath he made in 1858, that his wife Claire and his scattered children had been avenged, that justice, delayed and imperfect but real, had finally been served. The Black Widower's revenge stands as one of the most extraordinary acts of resistance in American history, a story that deserves to be remembered and studied, a reminder that even in the darkest times, even under the most oppressive systems, human beings find ways to assert their dignity and demand recognition of their humanity. What do you think of this story? Was Thomas Winchester's revenge justified, or did he go too far? Did the plantation masters get what they deserved, or did innocent people suffer for crimes they didn't commit? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. If this story moved you or made you think about justice and revenge in new ways, hit that like button and share this video with someone who appreciates complex historical narratives. Subscribe to this channel for more forgotten stories from America's past, stories that challenge us to think about who we were and who we want to be. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.
They say just forget. Move on like it's easy. But forgetting you feels like remembering someone I've never seen. I've been trying to erase you from the places in my mind, but the harder that I fight it, the more you're hard to leave behind. Every memory keeps slipping through the cracks I try to close, like a face I should remember, but somehow never know. Forgetting you feels impossible, like chasing something I can't hold, like trying to remember someone that I've never even known. I keep reaching through the silence for a past I can't undo, 'cause letting go of what we had feels like losing something true. Every moment turns to fragments, every thought just fades to blue, like I'm searching for a feeling that still only leads to you. Forgetting you feels impossible, like chasing something I can't hold, like trying to remember someone that I've never even known. I keep reaching through the silence for a past I can't undo, 'cause letting go of what we had feels like losing something true. But now every empty moment still reminds me what is real. Forgetting you feels impossible, like chasing something I can't hold, like trying to remember someone that I've never even known. I keep reaching through the silence for a past I can't undo, 'cause letting go of what we had feels like losing something true. Don't pity me. My heart doesn't need your mercy. I can still stand on my own. I was broken by your leaving, fell deeper than I thought I would. But pain has taught me how to heal now and survive what once I couldn't. You don't have to look back sadly, don't reach out with guilty hands. What you shattered made me stronger. Now I rise where I once collapsed. My heart doesn't need your pity, not another empty sign. I've got enough strength left within me to rebuild this life of mine. My feet are steady through the sorrow. I can stand through all the pain. You don't have to save me, darling. I'll learn to breathe again. I once begged for your affection. Now I've learned my worth in scars. And the man you left in pieces found his own way through the dark. My heart doesn't need your pity, not another empty sign. I've got enough strength left within me to rebuild this life of mine. My feet are steady through the sorrow. I can stand through all the pain. You don't have to save me, darling. I'll learn to breathe again. Begun. My heart doesn't need your pity, not another empty sign. I've got enough strength left within me to rebuild this life of mine. My feet are steady through the sorrow. I can stand through all the pain. You don't have to save me, darling. I'll rise alone again. I'll rise alone